human body, exposed to sub-zero temperatures, can lose heat 25 times faster in wet conditions. Hypothermia begins its lethal work in minutes. A body can freeze solid in under 3 hours. How then did the indigenous peoples of North America thrive for millennia in the brutal, unforgiving winters of the continent? Was it simply raw endurance? A biological resilience that modern humans have lost? The answer is far more complex and far more impressive. It is not a story of toughness, but of sophisticated, localized engineering. It is a story of physics, thermodynamics, and a profound understanding of the natural world that has been almost entirely forgotten. The enemy was not the cold itself. The enemy was physics. Heat, by its very nature, seeks equilibrium. It relentlessly escapes from a warm body into the cold air through conduction, convection, and radiation. To survive a freezing night was to wage a constant, minute-by-minute war against these forces. In this war, a single mistake, a poorly sealed shelter, a damp piece of clothing, a miscalculation of calories, was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. When we imagine this survival, we often conjure a single, monolithic image. But there was no one Native American way to survive the cold. The strategies were as diverse as the landscapes. The challenge of a dry, wind-blasted plains blizzard, where temperatures could drop 50 degrees in an hour, was entirely different from the damp, heavy snow cold of the Northeast Woodlands. To answer the question of survival, one cannot look for a single technique. One must look at specific, brilliant solutions born from centuries of observation and lethal trial and error. Historians and archaeologists still debate the precise origins of many of these adaptations, but the results are undeniable. The nomadic peoples of the Great Plains, like the Lakota, needed a shelter that could be collapsed in minutes, moved by horse or dog, and yet withstand 80-mile-per-hour winds. The agricultural peoples of the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee, faced different pressures. They needed a permanent fortress to house hundreds, capable of retaining heat for months on end, using minimal fuel. Both solutions solved the same core problem: air control. The primary challenge of any shelter is not just blocking the wind, but managing the air. Inside. Inhaled air is cold. Exhaled air is warm, but dangerously moist. A fire generates heat, but it also consumes oxygen and produces smoke. A perfectly sealed structure would kill its inhabitants as quickly as the cold. A drafty one would simply funnel the heat outside. The genius of these ancient architectures was in their ability to channel the air, to create deliberate, controlled convection currents. They turned the laws of physics from an enemy into an engine. Before modern insulation, before central heating, these designs achieved a level of thermal efficiency that is staggering. To understand how they survived, we must first look to the Great Plains, at a structure that is globally recognized, but almost universally misunderstood. An icon of the American West that was, in reality, a thermodynamic marvel. The iconic Lakota teepee, or teepee, is often misunderstood as a simple, primitive tent. In reality, it was a portable, precisely engineered survival machine, a masterpiece of thermodynamics perfectly adapted to the harsh, windswept Great Plains. Its genius was not in insulation, but in air control. The structure's power began with its foundation. The Lakota traditionally favored a 3-pole foundation, creating a strong tripod. Around 15 more poles, often slender, strong lodgepole pines, were layered onto this base, creating the distinct conical shape. This cone was not a perfect symmetrical cone. It was deliberately tilted, with a steeper back and a more gradual slope at the front, where the entrance was. This aerodynamic design, braced by the poles, could withstand the relentless gales of the plains, a feat a modern dome tent could never replicate. The entrance, typically covered by a hide flap, almost always faced east, welcoming the morning sun and turning its back to the prevailing westerly winds. But the teepee's true brilliance was invisible. It was hidden in its dual-wall construction. Inside the main cover of stitched bison hides, the inhabitants hung a second, partial wall, an inner lining, or ozone. This lining was not sewn to the outer wall. It hung from the poles, starting several feet off the ground and stopping well below the smoke hole at the apex. This created a critical air gap, turning the entire structure into a highly efficient convection engine. Here is the physics of how it worked. The central fire, small and controlled, was the engine. As it burned, it radiated heat, warming the inhabitants. But it also consumed oxygen, and the hot, smoky air rose. This rising air had to be replaced. Cold, dense air from the outside would seep under the edge of the outer cover. But it could not hit the people inside. It was immediately stopped by the inner lining. Forced into the gap between the two walls, this cold air was channeled upwards. As it rose, it was warmed by the radiant heat of the fire passing through the inner lining. By the time this fresh, oxygen-rich air spilled over the top of the lining into the living space, it was no longer a freezing draft. It was pre-warmed, fresh air. This system created a continuous, circular flow. Cold air in, fresh, warm air for breathing, and smoke and stale air drawn perfectly up and out the top. Even the top was an active piece of technology. The smoke hole was flanked by two large flaps, or ears, each controlled by an external pole. These were not decorations. They were a sophisticated ventilation system. By angling the flaps relative to the wind, the inhabitants could use the Venturi effect. The wind rushing over the angled flaps created a low-pressure zone, which actively sucked the smoke out of the teepee, preventing the wind from blowing it back down. Historians and cultural anthropologists still discuss the regional variations, particularly the foundational structure. While many Lakota and other Siouan groups favored the stable three-pole foundation, other nations like the Crow and Blackfeet often preferred a four-pole base. This seemingly minor difference dictated the entire geometry and wrapping of the shelter. But the core principle remained. The teepee was not a passive barrier against the cold. It was an active, breathing system for processing the elements, allowing its occupants to remain warm, dry, and smoke-free in the most brutal winter storms. In the dense, snow-heavy forests of the Northeast Woodlands, the challenge was not mobility, but permanence. Here, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, engineered a solution based on entirely different principles: communal living and thermal mass. Their answer to the freezing nights was the Haudenosaunee, or Longhouse, a structure that was less a tent and more a permanent living vessel. These were not small huts. The Haudenosaunee Longhouse was a marvel of architecture. A massive post and beam structure, often stretching over 200 feet in length, longer than a modern NHL hockey rink. It was framed with sturdy timber poles, bent and lashed together to create a long, arched roof, a shape ideal for shedding heavy snow. The entire structure was sheathed in overlapping, foot-wide shingles of elm bark. This bark, harvested in the spring when sap was running, was flattened, dried, and sewn to the frame. When layered, it functioned like medieval armor, repelling wind, rain, and snow, while trapping air in its fibrous layers. But the true genius of the Longhouse was its solution to the heat loss equation. Instead of a single family battling the cold, the Longhouse pooled the resources of an entire clan, sometimes as many as 20 families. Inside, a long central corridor ran the length of the building. Along this aisle, a series of shared fires burned, each hearth serving two families living in compartments on opposite sides. The physics here were fundamentally different from the teepee. The teepee managed airflow. The Longhouse managed thermal stability. The sheer volume of the interior space acted as a massive heat sink. The continuous, low-burning fires, the body heat of 60 to 100 people, and the insulated bark walls all contributed to a stable interior climate. While the outside temperature might plunge to -20 degrees, the inside remained above freezing, a task that would be impossible for a single family in a small, uninsulated shelter. The Longhouse didn't just block the cold. It created and held its own microclimate. Ventilation was a shared responsibility. A series of holes were cut along the apex of the roof, one above each hearth. In fair weather, these were left open to draw smoke out. But in a blizzard, sliding panels of bark could be used to cover them, leaving only a small gap. The interior was undoubtedly smoky, a fact confirmed by archaeological analysis of Longhouse remains. But this was a trade-off. The smoke, trapped in the high-arched ceiling, created a secondary layer of warm air, a thermal blanket, that further insulated the living space below. Historians and archaeologists still debate the precise details of the interior. Were the family compartments fully walled, or were they open-ended cubicles? The evidence suggests the latter, which would have been crucial for allowing the heat from the central fires to radiate and circulate into every living space. The Longhouse was, in effect, a human ark. It was a communal fortress designed not to move, but to endure. A testament to the idea that in the face of overwhelming cold, the most effective survival tool was not just engineering, but community. Surviving the freezing night was not just a battle of architecture. It was a war of internal thermodynamics. A shelter, no matter how brilliant, is useless if the human furnace inside it runs out of fuel. The body's relentless generation of heat, its metabolism, burns calories at a ferocious rate in the cold. To stay alive, this fuel had to be constantly replenished with high-energy, portable, and long-lasting food. The most sophisticated solution to this problem was a substance known as pemmican. Pemmican was not simply dried meat. It was a caloric superweapon. The process of its creation was a masterpiece of food science, perfected by the peoples of the Great Plains, but adopted and traded widely. First, lean meat, typically bison, was cut into thin strips and slowly dried over a fire or in the sun until brittle. This meat was then placed in a hide bag and pulverized into a fine powder. Into this powder, hunters and processors poured an equal measure of rendered, liquefied bison fat, the tallow. Finally, dried and crushed berries, like choke cherries, were often added for flavor and nutrients. The genius was in the fat. Fat is the most energy-dense food on Earth, containing more than twice the calories per gram as protein. The rendering process, melting the fat, was the key. This liquid fat coated every single particle of the powdered meat, driving out all the air. As the mixture cooled, the fat solidified, creating a rock-hard, non-perishable brick. By eliminating air and moisture, the process made bacterial decay almost impossible. A single pound of pemmican could contain over 3,500 calories, and properly prepared, it could last for decades. It was a portable, stable, and powerful fuel that could sustain a hunter or a family through the leanest, coldest months. This internal furnace was protected by an equally sophisticated external system: clothing. The indigenous peoples of North America were the original masters of layered, high-performance apparel. They understood a principle that modern mountaineers live by. The greatest insulator is not the material itself, but trapped air. A single thick garment is inefficient. It gets compressed, and it traps moisture from sweat. A wet garment in sub-zero temperatures is a death sentence, as water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air. The solution was a system of layers. The inner layer, closest to the skin, was often made of incredibly soft, pliable, brain-tanned deerskin. It was breathable and wicked moisture away. The next layer was the insulation. This is where the physics gets fascinating. Many groups, particularly in the far north, wore fur garments with the fur turned inward. While it seems counterintuitive, this method traps the maximum amount of warm air generated by the body. Next, to the skin, using the dense underfur and long guard hairs to create a thick, stable pocket of warmth. The outer layer was the shell, a tough, wind-resistant hide like a bison robe, worn with the thick hair facing out to shed snow and blunt the force of the wind. This system extended to the extremities. While historians still debate the full variety of materials, many groups packed their moccasins with insulating materials like dried grass or shredded sagebrush. This vegetation functioned exactly like modern fiber insulation, trapping thousands of tiny air pockets to protect the feet from freezing ground. This material science was a conscious, deliberate strategy, a wearable shelter that allowed them to function, hunt, and travel in a world that, to an unprepared modern human, would be instantly lethal. The modern world has become reliant on a single, brute force strategy for cold: insulation. We build thick, sealed walls of foam and fiberglass, creating a stark, binary division between inside and outside. We then burn massive amounts of energy to heat the inside, isolating ourselves from the environment. This method is effective, but it is also fragile. It is a strategy of isolation, not adaptation. The strategies of the Lakota and Haudenosaunee reveal a profoundly different and perhaps more resilient philosophy. They did not, and could not, rely on a single, passive barrier. Their survival depended on a dynamic engagement with the laws of physics. The Lakota teepee was not an insulated box. It was a breathing, responsive system. It channeled the cold, using the properties of convection to draw in fresh air, preheat it, and exhaust smoke. It was a solution as mobile and flexible as the people who used it. The Haudenosaunee Longhouse was not a private, sealed shelter. It was a communal fortress that pooled the two most precious resources: heat and people. It used the principle of thermal mass to create a stable microclimate, a human-made ark that could ride out the winter. It was a solution built on the power of community. The clothing and the fuel, the layered, breathable hides, and the caloric density of pemmican followed the same philosophy. They were not about simply blocking the cold. They were about managing the internal environment. The layers managed moisture and trapped air, while the pemmican managed the body's internal furnace. In every case, the solution was specific, intelligent, and multi-layered. This is the forgotten blueprint. We, in our modern, heated homes, are often more vulnerable than our ancestors. A simple power failure during a winter storm can, in a matter of hours, turn our advanced shelters into deadly, frigid traps. We have forgotten how to manage airflow. We have forgotten the insulating power of community. We have forgotten that survival is not about building a high-tech wall, but about possessing a deep understanding of the world around us. Survival in the freezing cold was never about a single tool or raw, animalistic endurance. It was a sophisticated, holistic system of engineering, biology, and social strategy. The Lakota teepee's mastery of airflow, the Haudenosaunee Longhouse's use of communal thermal mass, and the precise food science of pemmican all prove the same fundamental point. These cultures did not just survive, in their environment. They survived with it. They adapted to the cold, using its own physical laws against it, rather than simply declaring war on it. In a world of increasing uncertainty, where our centralized systems reveal their fragility, this ancient wisdom, this blueprint for resilience, efficiency, and community, may be the most critical survival tool we have lost.